This is a revision video for the part of the specification on attachment called the influence of early attachment, including the role of the internal working model. This is on the advanced information for exams 2022, and I presume it could come up on any future exams. So we're looking at the key study called the Love Quiz. This is by Hazen and Shaver, and they wanted to look at how early experiences would influence later adult romantic relationships. So their procedure was to put a love quiz in a newspaper. So it was 1987, the olden days before online, and people had to fill in the quiz in the newspaper and send it back. And 620 people sent back the love quiz, and it was asking questions about their current attachment experiences and about their attachment history, because they wanted to identify current and childhood attachment types. And then it also asked questions about attitudes to love, which was an assessment of the internal working model. So 620 people sent them back, more women than men, but it was from a fair cross-section of the population. And the findings were, the first finding was that they found very similar attachment types to Ainsworth's findings of the strange situations. So this is really to highlight that the population was pretty normal, that most people were securely attached, followed by insecure avoidant, followed by insecure resistant. And another finding was that they found a positive correlation between attachment type and love experiences. So what that means is that the more securely attached a person was, the more love experiences they had and the better love experiences they had. They also found a relationship between the conception of love, which is the internal working model, and attachment type. So securely attached individuals tended to have a positive internal working model. So that scattergram there shows you that the more positive their internal working model, the more securely attached they were. So securely attached adults in the love quiz, they describe their love experiences as happy, friendly and trusting, and they emphasize being able to accept and support their partner despite faults. And the relationships were longer as well, 10 years on average compared to 5 and 6 years for resistant and avoidant participants. So we've mentioned like the internal working model here, and it mentions it in the spec twice on the attachment unit. So it's really important that you can have a very clear definition practiced before the exam. So the internal working model means that the first relationship you have with your primary caregiver acts as a blueprint for all future relationships. So this mental representation of what a relationship is will influence your expectations of relationships in the future. So it's saying that that first relationship you have with your mum, the more sensitive she is to your needs, and apologies here, we often mention the mother when we're talking about the internal working model because Bowlby identified it, and Bowlby was kind of back in the day, even before I was born, and so at that point in history it tended to be the mother who was the primary caregiver. So it was saying that the sensitivity of the relationship between the mum and the baby was really crucial because the baby can't remember it, but it internalizes it and it kind of has expectations. It knows what a loving relationship is, or it doesn't know. And so the internal working model can be really positive, where both the baby and the mother gain pleasure from that experience and that relationship, and it's a really positive one. And in that case, the baby would go on to be have very positive relationships, whereas if it was a poor internal working model where the mother hadn't been sensitive and there was no joy, then that will influence later relationships. The other important thing to say is the kind of relationships the internal working model will affect. So it's identified that it's childhood friendships, romantic relationships, and the relationships with their own children. So therefore, the behaviours influenced by the internal working model are childhood friendships, and that was looked at by the Minnesota Child Parent Study, who found a continuity between early attachment and later emotional and social behaviour, meaning that the internal working model would affect the child's friendships while they're growing up. It also affects their ability to parent. So we remember about Harlow, and we'll look at that in the evaluation, but Harlow's monkey study found that the monkeys who had been separated from their mothers and had those awful wire mothers and cloth mothers, they had an inability to parent and couldn't cradle their own babies. The internal working model will also affect your romantic relationships, and we can see we've already looked at the key study for that, the Hazen and Shaver Love Quiz. And then also it can affect mental health. So that was the description of the influence of early attachment on later relationships. So the evaluation obviously is just as important, and if you get a 16 marker you need 10 marks. So I'm going to give you 5 evaluation points, and most teachers would recommend and examiners would recommend that you would aim to do at least 3 or 4, and there's something called the depth-breadth trade-off, where you can either do fewer evaluation points in a lot more detail or more evaluation points in less detail. So the first one I'm hoping will be quite easy and stick in your head, because we're using information from earlier in the unit. So Harlow studied monkeys, and you can see in the picture there that the baby monkey is clinging to the soft monkey mother with no milk. And so that experiment was really to try and find out why monkeys and people, why they attach. However, a later finding from that study was that the babies who had been separated actually were really poor parents themselves. They attacked their own babies and they couldn't cradle their own babies. So that animal study provides evidence that the internal working model can influence the ability to parent. And then you can follow that up with a human study. So Quinton studied women brought up in children's homes compared to women who were raised in their own homes. And they found the ones who were ex-institutionalized, so the ones brought up in children's homes, had a lot of difficulty parenting, and that more of their children had spent time in care compared to controls. So their ability to parent was that bad that some had children taken into care because they just couldn't cope and they didn't know what to do. So you've got evidence there for both animal studies and human studies. That's a really good research support for that idea of the internal working model influencing ability to parent. We can go into some methodological problems with the love quiz. So as long as you mentioned and talk about the love quiz in your AO1, then we can criticise it for being correlational research. So a problem of all correlational research is that it doesn't show causation, and that is true also of the influence of early attachments. So there could be an intervening variable such as temperament, and we've looked at Kagan's temperament hypothesis earlier in the unit. So an infant's temperament could explain the way a parent responds to the child and be a determining factor in its attachment. And their temperament might also affect the way it relates in later life and impact on their adult relationships. We've also got methodological problems to do with the love quiz itself because it's self-report. So we've got the issues of retrospective classification and social desirability. So you'd need to really explain those regarding this particular study. So questionnaires about childhood rely on the participant having a good memory and telling the truth rather than giving socially desirable answers. But memory is extremely fragile, which you'll know from the memory unit, and so people's memories of their childhood might not be accurate. They also might be distorted by things that they think happened that maybe didn't necessarily happen. And also they're likely to give socially desirable answers because the questions were asking about their childhood experiences and their current love experiences, and the questions might have been quite personal. People might not want to admit that they have an issue with, say, a parent, or that their current relationship isn't everything that it should be. And so even though their parents and partners weren't necessarily going to see the love quiz, people still answer in a socially desirable way. So make sure you kind of give an example if you're talking about social desirability. Don't just say it's self-report, therefore there's social desirability. Make it effective, give an example, and then conclude with both of these problems lead to validity issues because we may be measuring data that is incorrect. We might be measuring incorrect memories and we might be measuring socially desirable ones. However, there is evidence to back up the findings of the love quiz, and it was a longitudinal study, which was really good because it means we're not going to make kind of snap decisions or conclusions based on one study. This went on over a number of months or years, I think. So the study assessed infant attachment type at 1 year of age and found that securely attached infants were more socially competent as children, which brought them closer to their friends, and that they were more emotionally attached to their romantic partners in adulthood. So this is great research to back up the love quiz and also the idea that it affects friendships. And this suggests that attachment type does predict future relationships and that your internal working model will influence that. The final point is that it's a problem, saying that this whole theory is overly deterministic. So there's a picture there, and it's a terrible picture, and I'm so sorry it's such a rubbish picture of Joe Wicks, who's an incredibly physically fit individual, but this was the only free picture I could find, I'm afraid, so sorry Joe Wicks. But I watched a documentary the other day on iPlayer called it was called Facing My Childhood, with Joe Wicks talking about his very chaotic upbringing, the difficulties that he endured with both parents really, but you know that his mum really struggled because she was so young and his dad was an addict, and so it was such an interesting documentary. I highly recommend you watch it, but it highlighted to me that the theory that we're looking at is overly deterministic. It's saying that if you've got a poor internal working model, and if you've got insecure attachments, and if you've had all these troubles, that you can't overcome them. But Joe Wicks has overcome them. If you watch the documentary, he talks about having a very good relationship with his parents now, and you can, whether that is hopeful on his half or whether he's made that happen, but you look at also the way he is with his own children and how important that is to him, and that he's saying, you know, he was just desperately wanting to be there for them in the way that his dad wasn't there for him when he was growing up, and reading to them every night was just so important. And you could see it was utterly heartwarming because he's reading with his children, and he did something that I used to do when I had babies, and you read a bit of the book and you leave the word for them to fill in words. They can't read, but they're kind of joining in, and it's so obvious that those are the parents that read with their children regularly. You know, this was not put on for the cameras in any shape or form. It was just so obvious. And so if you're talking about the influence of early attachment and the internal working model, then it's too deterministic. You can use Joe Wicks as an example, surprise the examiners with information about him, but don't ramble on about him too much. The important thing is that it's you can overcome it somehow, and Joe Wicks overcame it, and anyone else can, you know, especially if they get help and therapy, and some people just have that ability to overcome it. So Simpson concluded the research didn't suggest that an individual's past unalterably determined the future course of his or her relationships. You could have a go at a past paper question. This was from June 2016, so you could pause the video, have a look at that question, and then the mark schemes on the next slide. So again, pause the video and have a look at the mark scheme. So it's really important to do that. So this video is known as revision in because I'm giving you some information. However, you're never going to recall all of that. You need to do the revision out, which is doing the hard questions, exam style papers, and all that kind of stuff, in order to actually practice your skills on this particular topic. And these are the picture references.